Pericles and Athens by A.R. Byrne, The Golden Age of Greece, seen through the life of her leading statesman. Greek, I think is how you pronounce, because isn't it, or is that just the stereotypical fake Greek writing? There's so much of that stuff. Chapter 9, The Glory of Athens. And part of my reason for sharing this, aside from throwing in my comments and making sure that there is an audio available for free for people who want to listen to it of this program, is to compare it to what is going on and what we can learn about it, and not be a part of the downfall of America in particular. The years of Pericles' supremacy saw also the construction of the great buildings, among which the new temple of Athene was only one, though the greatest. Released from war, Athenian energies flowed swiftly into the new channel. Plutarch gives a vivid picture of Athens under the full employment policy. And that is what we should be striving towards, rather than hordes of disabled veterans and some people that think there should be a better base wage for those who aren't disabled than even some people working. Well, nobody should be being paid that little if they're actually working for a living, but yeah, when the hardship's over, use your strength to accomplish more when it's not around. For Pericles wished the common people too to have their share in the profits of empire, but not to be paid for doing nothing. And so he brought before them the great projects for buildings and plans that employ many handicrafts, so that those at home, no less than those who served in the fleet and army and garrisoned the empire, might have their share and support from the public funds, for every kind of material was used, stone and bronze, ivory and gold, ebony and cypress wood, and there was work for every craft, carpenter and molder, and smiths and masons, dyers, goldsmiths, ivory workers, embroiderers, turners, as well as transport services, the merchants and sailors, and navigators at sea, and by land, the Wainwrights, I can't think of what that is at the moment, and the breeders of oxen, the drivers, the rope makers, the workers in flax and leather, the road makers and miners, and every art had, as it were, an army under its command, of the unskilled laborers as the instrument and body of its work. Thus the need for workers disseminated prosperity through the ranks of men of every age and character, and as the buildings rose, imposing in size and matchless in their beauty and grace, while the workers vied with one another in the skill of their craftsmanship, the most surprising thing was the speed of their building, for works that one would have thought could hardly be accomplished in several successive generations were all accomplished in the prime of one man's political life. But if the people are overworked, then they get burnt out and maybe disabled, and then you don't have a second chance. So you figure out what the balance is to have a strong empire. An early item among these public works was the middle long wall, already mentioned, directed by Callicrates. Callicrates' name also appears in a decree about 448, where he is instructed to design a suitable door for the open-air precinct of Our Lady of Victory on the citadel of the little Temple of Victory that stands there now. It's some 25 years later. It looks as though he were regularly retained by the state. And when for the great temple of Athena of the city, we find his name joined with that of another architect, Iktinos. We may suppose that Iktinos was the artist and designer, and Callicrates the organizer and engineer, but many other works were put in hand at the same time, and two of them, Greek architects, had to tackle the problem of roofing a space to accommodate a considerable audience without use of the arch or dome, a problem which involved the difficulty of sitting the necessary pillars so not to obstruct the view. One of these was the Hall of the Mysteries at Eleusis, where the devotees witnessed those secret rites of the corn goddess, kernels, wheat in particular, which Callias, the torchbearer, was the hereditary chief priest. Rites that gave hope of a glorified resurrection like that of the corn of wheat that falls to the ground and dies. Iktinos was said by some later Greeks to have been the architect of this hall, and to Pericles as commissioner, but Plutarch names three other architects. One having died during the work, and not Iktinos. The other hall was the concert hall, the Odeon, by unnamed architect, with a high tent-like, canonical roof, said to have been inspired by that of Xerxes' great pavilion captured at Plataea, a building particularly near to Pericles' heart. In it were held musical contests in lyre playing and flute playing and singing, which on Pericles' own proposal were at this time added to the athletic contests and processions at the Acropolis at the 4-yearly festival of Athena, the great Panathenea. Pericles himself was elected a marshal of the games at the next Panathenea, probably 442, and personally drew up regulations for the musical contests. Kratinos has a typical crack at him, his skull, his Odeon, his escape from Ostrakismos, and his liking for appearing in a helmet, all in 3 lines. And here behold our onion-headed Zeus approaches with the Odeon on his crown, now that the Ostracron has passed him by. I have no idea what sort of tune it would actually have, but that's what I thought of in the moment. But we see here in the Eleusinian Mysteries some elements that would be mainstream and alternative Christianity. Now, if that wasn't enough to state the origins of Christianity, the Mithric religions turn out not to be something between the writings of the Gospels and the Didache. Well, the Gospels were being edited, but that was supposed for a long time. It's something that happened in the 200s. It wasn't, Mithraism didn't exist, but Mithraism by name among the Persians and whom you'd call the Hindus goes back over 4,000 years before what you'd call, Christianity, what you call Christianity. Easter and Christmas were celebrated at Christmas over 3,000 years prior. Easter, same time of year, same name really. So it's interesting to see that. And we also see, the Catholic attention on the, Mary and stuff like this. Oh, well, they had their Our Lady, and well, I mean, the Athenians had that too. So it's like the types of mythology, it wasn't unique at all. They just renamed it. It's like, why disbelieve all the other names this type of mythology has had and now accept this new one? Also in the early 40s, as we now know from the American excavations, another temple was begun on Market Hill, the little rising ground overlooking the marketplace, behind the council chamber and the roundhouse, where the praetorians on duty lived, a temple smaller and plainer than the Parthenon, yet dignified enough when seen as it was meant to be, and can now be seen again. At the top of its bank, above the heart of the city, this was the temple of Hephaestus, god of the metalworkers, long known to travelers as Theseum. Its true dedication, long suspected, has been proved by the Americans' discovery of the sites of many forges in the area round about. Its building took longer than that of the Parthenon. Its unknown architects in the latter stages borrowed some ideas from the great work of Ictanos. Perhaps one may infer that it was paid for not by state funds, but chiefly by the craftsmen who lived and worked around it. In the same quarter of the old town, the Athens inhabited from that time to this, where the street of the smiths still rings with the beating of iron and copper at the present day. But all other buildings were outshone, then, no less by now, by the great house of Athena of the city, which presently came to be called the Parthenon. On the foundations laid long since, on the highest part of the citadel, foundations designed, as may be seen on the spot, for a rather narrower and longer building, the workmen under Callicrates, Ictinos, and the sculptor Phidias erected the most perfect of European buildings, there to stand intact with all its sculptures, as temples are, as church of another virgin, are as a mosque, until the modern siege in 1687. A German gunner in the service of the Italian general blew up a Turkish powder magazine inside the building, demolishing the roof on both side walls with their pillars. An episode only too typical in the history of modern Greece, between the great powers of East and West. After that, it only remained for a British ambassador to Turkey to remove the sculptures. And when the religion changes, it's still important to use the old sites sometimes, because there's energies both in use, and maybe there's some natural thing that was used, and sometimes the location just happens to be the best for a temple of the city otherwise. So don't feel like ruin. Well, preserving history is important enough, but don't feel like the fact that ruins exist have to control you. There is little point in indulging in lyrical generalities about the great buildings. The way to study them is to see them under their own sky, bright in the sun or ethereal under the moon, an experience which, experto crede, repays any trouble. If one cannot visit Athens, a good second best is to study them in one of the many good books of photographs, some of which are, or should be, in every library. Words can only be a commentary on the experience, not a substitute, and those that follow will therefore be strictly factual. Now, one benefit to my library is the simple fact that we have different text, right? And these texts, whether or not there's pictures, forms like a picture. So when I pick it up, this particular version has memories of me attached to it. But the pictures of the artifacts and the cultures are important too. Sometimes years later, I will figure out something in a book that I have not read since. But I remember when I pick it up and I flip through it, and it's like I figured out something even the author hasn't sometimes because of the information that is there. The new temple was to be a large one, as befitted the dignity of Athens, nearly 230 feet by just over 100, 70 times 31 meters, along the top stem of its foundations, and in that Doric style, which was still the only style for Greek temples west of the Aegean, a style exceedingly simple, the translation into stone of a Bronze Age chieftain's long hall, with porch and veranda, but enriched through generations of experience with all manner of subtleties, designed to lead, rest, and delight the eye, with the deliberate repetition of vertical and horizontal lines, with the contrast between restrained but elaborate ornament above and the plain colonnade below, and with the play on delicately proportioned masses of the dry Mediterranean light. And here the refinements of the Parthenon begin. We have spoken of vertical and horizontal lines, but in fact there is scarcely a horizontal or vertical line or plane, indeed not a single significant straight line, on the whole building. The fluted pillars not only taper from base to neck, giving the impression of firmness and stability, they also curve ever so little, convexly. The entasis, which is quite perceptible if one looks at two pillars from within at such an angle as to leave a narrow band of light between them. But the angle pillars are slightly thicker than the others, a fact not perceptible without use of the measuring tape. The later Greco-Roman architecture writers say that this was for the correction of an optical illusion in a bright light, lest the corner columns seen against the sky should appear less massive than the rest. Even more subtly, every column leans very slightly inwards, the angle columns twice as much as the others, since they are inclined in two planes. It has been calculated that, bearing slight errors in execution, of which, since the builders were men, a few of them can be detected by measurement, the axes of all the pillars, if produced, would meet at a vertical height of about a mile, even if the level floor of the stylobate, the stepped foundation on which the pillars stand. It is not really level at all. It rises ever so slightly in a gentle budge, not a crude curve, towards the center of each side, 2 3/4 inches in the middle of each end, and even more gently, about 4 inches in long side, for the sake of drainage. Some may prosaically suspect, but this still leaves the execution of the refinements by the masons and stone cutters a marvel much greater than the conception of the idea, and in favor of the view that it was meant to have aesthetic significance. It's the fact that the whole entablature, all that rests upon the pillars, rises towards the center of each side, parallel to the lift of the stylobate. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls Uncovered and other books like that, who's the author? Oh, well, it's the Barnes and Nobles edition. R. Eisenman and M. Wise. Just like the Hanukkah readings of clothing, of all the page after page of biblical temple furniture, some very specifics were preserved about the buildings that were given sacred significance, the very dimensions and all that sort of stuff. But there can be messages hidden in that sort of thing. These refinements, invisible, are all but invisible to the casual eye, do in fact go so far to account for the unique satisfactoriness of the simple lines of the Parthenon that they were deliberately designed to that end, is the tradition reported by the Roman Vitruvius, who drew on Greek architectural writers. They were not invented by Iktinos out of nothing. Entasis of the pillars is normal in Doric buildings. Curvature of the stylobate is found in the sturdy archaic temple at Corinth, built 100 years before, but they were not invariably found in the Hephaestus temple, for example. The floor is flat, and their success is best seen simply by looking at the two temples, one after another. The Parthenon is to Hephaestion as the music of Bach to ordinary good music of his day. The difference is the measure of what we owe to the individual man, Iktinos, the artist who was backed by Pericles. By 438, the Parthenon was complete. With most of its sculpture, so swiftly was Greek art developing that even within those 10 years' work, the combatants of Greeks and centaurs, gods and giants and the like, civilization versus barbarism, which filled the square metopis above the colonnade outside, are perceptibly less mature in style than the frieze high up on the wall of the cell or temple inside the colonnade. Now, the sort of messages can kind of change with time of what is focused on. So what would be the spiritual focus of civilization versus wild country of oral tradition? We talk about draconian, but draconian kind of, ignorance is not an excuse. Having set laws, that sort of thing was. I like the four-sided little figures of which the law was written on, which kind of possibly gives a connection to the order of 9 angles and where that comes from. The whole of this work, says Plutarch, was organized and directed by Phidias, the sculptor friend of Pericles. Phidias also wrought the huge, severe bronze statue of the armed Athena that stood near the entrance to the rock, a figure 60 feet high, the gleam of whose spear and helmet were visible to sailors on a clear day many miles out to sea. Pericles himself, we learn from a piece of current gossip, was a frequent visitor to the workshops. For an artist to be not only patronized by, but on personal terms of friendship with a great statesman was something new in Greek society. It is noteworthy that while almost all the great poets of Greece in the 6th and 5th centuries move in the high society of their cities, the artists are generally socially obscure. They were artisans, respected for their skill, but below the salt, in our old feudal expression. The old position is typical of contrasts between aristocratic Greek attitude to the work of the mind of man and the work of his hands. Under Phidias must have worked many of these nameless artisan sculptors, the same men who carved the tombstones that are treasured in modern museums. Phidias' work on the Parthenon is an example of the fact that in art also, as in other human achievements, the genius depends for his opportunities on the whole condition, the whole level of achievement of society in his time. Now, you're going to see something happen. Something's happening in this time, and is the didactic and devotional function of art is going away. It's shifting from the message and the effect to the beauty and such of it. But our advances in technology, if that's what we're doing with it, we see part of what's going on in modern times. The effect of some of these modern cathedrals, and I guess you wouldn't call them cathedrals because they're not all Catholic, and not all with that sort of throne of mythology. Of course, they do think that about God. That God is supported by a throne. Not my God. Well, everyone's God, whatever. Well, your God, my God. It's like, it's not that way for if you're a monotheist. And if you're a henotheist, if other gods exist, well, just other gods exist. Don't. I just prefer this one. That's what you should be. But from Phidias' association with the Periclean circle sprang, as we may believe, one thing unique in Greek sculpture: the choice of a subject for the frieze of the Parthenon. Greek public art, architectural sculpture, like Greek poetry, except for personal lyric and eulogy, chose its subjects from the traditional mythology. This is not to say that Greek poetry and art were academic or out of touch with life. Far from it. The myths expressed and typified the ordinary people's hopes, fears, and aspirations, consciousness or subconscious, and had grown up and gained popularity for that reason, but for this very reason that the myths of the gods and heroes, of course the heroes become taken as gods later, right, adequately express man's deepest feelings. It was rare for scenes of ordinary contemporary life to penetrate into major Greek poetry or art. Satisfaction with the mythological as an expression of man's feeling was normal. What was rare was the feeling that modern contemporary life could be a suitable subject for great poetry or art. And as much as there's a lot of it, the density of the art about modern life is certainly going down. Such a feeling implies the realization that events of contemporary life can have the same universal significance as the deeds of mythic heroes, a realization achieved in Greece by a few rare spirits or by a whole population on rare occasions. The divine smith and Homer inlays the hero's shield with scenes of daily life, but other comparable descriptions of works of art are always confined to scenes from mythology. Hesiod had the vision of the poetry that is the significance of daily life and held it long enough to make it a poem of the farmer's year, but the school of poets that followed him applied even didactic, instructive poetry exclusively to teachings of the mythology. In Athenian tragedy, Phrynikos, at least twice, Aeschylus, at least once, had a poet's vision of the vital significance of the Persian wars, but it had faded in the light of common day among the more complex, less single-hearted moods of the years that followed. Greek painting, almost wholly lost to us, also sometimes rendered as modern subjects. There was a painting of the Battle of Marathon, by the Greek artist Palagnatas in the painted colonnade in the Agora, but sculpture hardly ever. Phidias's achievement are that of the Periclean Phidian Athens is the best example of all the raising of contemporary life in the artist's vision to the godlike plane. Round the Parthenon outside the colonnade, indeed, one saw the usual combatants of heroes and centaurs, Greeks and Trojans, Greeks and Amazons, gods defeating giants, the mythic symbols of Hellenism triumphing through struggle. But if one looked at the frieze inside the pillars, one saw that Athens, generally daring, had chosen for the subject of the band of sculpture Athenians at worship. One would like to know whether the assembly debated that choice. Now, while this building, while this temple room here is dedicated to divinity as the most loving, certainly all other qualities are taught. But look at what mythology does to us. Mythology is something full of meaning and use. So mythology can be directed by what's going on, and it can direct what's going on. It has those two functions. And certainly when we focus on certain divine qualities, we can become that. But in terms of becoming of those qualities, obviously, to our ability, obviously we don't become knowing of everything and various things like that. And certainly we should regard certain conditions if we're going to be the avenger. But one quality of divinity does not refute another quality of divinity. And it is important to to engage yourself in mythology that addresses all of life. And if I can't articulate a specific, well, maybe it's not that I can't articulate a specific. If there's a specific that someone would like me to say something about, I am certainly open to that. I've made broad-reaching playlists to do that sort of thing before, but look for a search, make a comment, question, of course, like and share.